This is MetroFocus with Rafael P. Roman, Jack Ford, and Jenna Flanagan.
Good evening and welcome to the MetroFocus Front Page Forecast. I'm Jenna Flanagan. In this week's look ahead at the major headlines, Governor Kathy Hochul pledges to avoid future lockdowns as COVID cases spike, and the city's health commissioner recommends New Yorkers mask up indoors once again. New York State is also looking for a new lieutenant governor after Brian Benjamin's resignation amid corruption charges. We'll discuss what the scandal means for his former boss, Governor Hochul, and the upcoming primary. And meanwhile, Mayor Eric Adams is trying to reassure New Yorkers that the subways are indeed safe after last week's horrific shooting in Brooklyn. Though a suspect is in custody, questions still remain about how he was able to evade police for so long and what the future of subway safety might look like. So joining us now to discuss these stories and give us what their take is on what else could drive the news this week, we are joined by J.C. Polanco. J.C. is, of course, an attorney, a political commentator, and a former president of the New York City Board of Elections who now teaches at CUNY BMCC. J.C., always great to have you on the show.
So happy to be here with all of you. Thank you.
We're also joined by Naila Amaru. Naila is a Democratic political strategist and the former executive director of the New York City Council Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. Naila, welcome to MetroFocus.
For having me.
And we're joined again by Alyssa Katz. Alyssa is the deputy editor of The City, the nonprofit news website covering New York. Alyssa, it's great to have you back.
I'm glad to be back.
All right, so let's start at the top. Alyssa, let's talk about COVID. We thought maybe we were done talking about COVID and that it was endemic, but we are seeing cases starting to go up again. Do you see New York City? There's recommendations of masking indoors again, but it seems like once most people were able to take off the mask, they don't want to put it back on. So do you see that as something the city might try to enforce again?
Well, that's a very interesting question. We've already seen Philadelphia, not that far from here, last week already reinstated its mask mandate for indoor spaces. I could see that potentially happening here in New York City. In addition to, of course, the mandate on public transportation, which is set at the federal level. And we can kind of use, I think, the New York City subways as a kind of good bellwether for how New Yorkers are conducting themselves, even when there is a mandate. We basically have no enforcement. And I'd say at this point, when I ride the subway, about a third of people are not wearing masks and the other 2/3 are wearing masks. And we are in a moment where that's kind of what you end up seeing out in public as well. People make their own decisions. I think, it's hard to say from where I sit. We each go through our lives with our own risk tolerance and our own vulnerabilities and risks. But I think the key question now is whether a kind of set your own risk tolerance policy, wear a mask if you choose to, don't if you don't, is that going to be viable as case rates go up, especially if we don't see a rise in hospitalizations or deaths, and whether Mayor Eric Adams and Governor Kathy Hochul are going to sort of see that as politically for them, as well as from a public health perspective, acceptable to kind of let everyone make their own decisions.
We know, JC, I'd love to get your take on this because we've talked a lot about, the, as Alyssa just said, the personal risk assessment that people are making. And is, I guess, a mask mandate really a mandate if there is no real hard enforcement?
I don't think we're going to see a mask mandate anytime soon. I'm not a doctor, but just politically speaking, in an election year, you're going to tell New Yorkers that they're going to have to put on a mask because of some variant that may be coming out when most of us are even boosted up, those of us who qualify for boosters. The truth of the matter is that rational New Yorkers have been vaccinated, have been boosted if they qualify, will be boosted if it's recommended that we need another one. The idea that we're going to wear masks at this point, it's obscene, not in an election year. We're tired of masks, to be honest with you. We're tired of seeing kids in masks. Now, barring one variant that is now hospitalizing a large number of New Yorkers, you're not going to see it. Politicians are not going to push for it, and New Yorkers aren't going to stand for it, especially those of us who have been vaccinated twice and boosted up and will be boosted up if required. It's just we're tired of it, and you're not going to see it. Now, a lot of us still wear them as Alyssa mentions, we wear them in the subways, we wear them on the bus. But the idea that we're going to walk around like we did 2 years ago is just, it's not going to happen.
Nyla, do you think that's fair, especially considering the fact that some people are saying that the case number increases is actually undercounted because so many people now have access to at-home tests?
Right. So I agree with a lot of points that both JC and Alyssa made. I think that there's the public health considerations, but particularly during the election year, the political considerations, right? And so I do think that the closest that we may get to quote unquote mandates would be people choosing to wear masks on public transit, if they have to, go to businesses that still, request that people wear masks when they go in. But politically, it's a difficult thread to needle when you are trying to get people to engage and return to quote unquote normal life, which has been the messaging at every level of government, particularly these last couple of months. And I also think, to the point that you raised, Jenna, it is incredibly difficult because access to, at-home testing is so accessible that it's not necessarily as public, or I think that the feeling as intense as it was maybe a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. If you tested positive, now people can isolate, and stay home, for 5-6 days, whatever the medical recommendation is, or as long as they choose to. I think that we're at a point during this pandemic where people are, making the decisions that are, best aligned with what they want to do, more so than really trying to stay in another lockdown, or really being forced to quote unquote, go back into a mandate as we were 2 years ago.
Of course. I do want to circle back though, because Alyssa, as you mentioned, people's behavior on the subway. I know that masking, of course, is something that New Yorkers are probably conscious of, but that's probably been pushed way far back in people's minds. And what's much more front and center is their safety on the subways. So first, just going back to the shooting that took place last week, what do we know about the suspect who is in custody right now?
Well, one thing that we know is that, he was someone with an ample amount of video evidence, right, of his state of mind. He's somebody who had his own YouTube channel, who put up videos where he showed himself to be obsessed with death and destruction, and also increasingly recently obsessed with New York City, its leaders, and in fact, with their the anti-gun and anti-crime subway enforcement. He had videos dedicated to everything Mayor Eric Adams was doing, and mocking it, saying, putting up, news clips that where Adams would, say that we're going to get control of crime in the subways, we're going to get control of guns, and this guy mocking it, saying, we'll see about that. Anyone could kind of, he made fun, for instance, of the incident where a woman got attacked with a guy with a cane in the Queensboro Plaza subway station, saying, look, an old guy like that could do this. He had a cane. He was laughing and laughing and laughing. So the evidence was out there. And yet the question becomes, what does one do about that when New York City, as we know from 9/11 and from so many other horrible incidents, we've seen racist attacks happen this way as well, where people see New York City as a national and international media stage, and they see violence in New York City as a way to get attention, fulfill sick fantasies. And I think that the isolation of the pandemic and its destructive role in mental health has just made that kind of attack on New York City by an unhinged lone individual like this just all the more likely, unfortunately.
Of course. And JC, also, what does it tell you that there was, initially he got away. There was a good 30 hours before he was located and captured. And then, of course, there's some stories that, he actually alerted the police. There was, of course, the Good Samaritan who flagged down officers when he saw him in McDonald's, et cetera. What is it about the way that this gentleman was captured and how long it took? Does that send up any red flags for you?
There's so many red flags to this story. It's incredible. First of all, we have to be vigilant about racist people and people online making a lot of the statements that this man did We've seen white supremacists do it. We've seen men like him who have been saying anti-white things. We see people say anti-Muslim things. We have to be vigilant about it. It's happening in every corner of our society. It's not just whites, it's not just blacks, it's not just Muslims. All of us have to be mindful that this is happening. And this man, as Alyssa mentioned, had his own channel spewing this hate across all sorts of media. Another issue is we got to remind your viewers, and I'm sorry if some of my panelists may not agree with me, but just a couple of years ago, the progressive elite in New York City were demanding that cops leave the subways because of some churro lady video where she was selling churros illegally in the subways, and that upset a lot of folks. You know, a lot of people clutched their pearls and demanded the cops be out of the subways, and that we need more elevators, not more NYPD. And now we see the reality of that nonsense. We see an increase in crime in our trains. We see sexual assaults, people being shoved into trains, people getting attacked, stabbed. We see constant crimes in our train stations. The same people 2 years ago that were that were begging for us to stop putting NYPD in the trains are the same people complaining today and passing memes throughout social media and Twitter about why it took the NYPD 30 hours. I mean, this is a city where at any point there's 10 million people. This is one individual who got out of a train, who changed his attire, took off his gas mask. Thank God we were able to find him in 30 hours. And thank God New Yorkers pulled together. And we have 5 individuals who are laying the claim to finally getting him arrested. And I'm very happy about that. And if he called on himself, maybe he wanted to surrender because of the heinous crime he committed. He couldn't live with himself. And lastly, Jenna, we have to stop immediately saying that bad people are severely mentally ill. It sends the wrong message. We have a problem with the severely mentally ill in our community. I've been talking about that with your viewers for a very long time. But the truth of the matter is that we have bad people out there as well. And this man, we haven't heard any diagnosis yet. So let's wait before calling him mentally ill until we get some information from the psychiatrists that are currently evaluating him.
Naila, I'd like to bring you in. I mean, again, as JC said, there are so many different red flags that this particular instance brought up, but what stands out to you?
Yes, I definitely agree with a few points that JC has made. I do just want to very quickly push back on the point regarding the narrative that folks on the left or progressives, which we're not necessarily calling for, from my understanding, a complete loss of presence of NYPDs in the subway transit system, more so than who they were targeting and who they were focusing on in their everyday work. Whereas I believe their argument was, the lady selling churros is not necessarily, the best way to focus when you do have legit criminals such as the subway shooter from last Tuesday. I think to your question, Jenna, again, a lot of red flags, a lot of breakdowns in terms of communications, in terms of subway system. I think for me, what stands out for me is the challenge that Mayor Adams has, who also began, I believe, his career as the transit cop many years ago. This idea of public safety and how it has different interpretations depending on where in New York you are. There are, to JC's point, there are folks who don't want cops in necessarily in the subway. There are folks who do want cop presence, but don't necessarily want them focusing on, the smaller, misdemeanors, types, petty crimes. And they want them more focused and invested on, getting the more legitimate, harmful, dangerous type of criminals. And then there are folks who definitely want a lot of presence of cops. And so I think for me, it taps into this larger conversation that we have been having for quite some time as New Yorkers in terms of what does public safety mean and for whom? And how does the use and function of the NYPD help us move towards this idea of what public safety means for us as New Yorkers, regardless of which borough we are in, and our relationships with those with the members of NYPD can be vastly different depending on our own experiences as New Yorkers.
Well, of course, that does go without said that the way that you viewed the NYPD would have a lot to do with what your community experience has been and where you are in the city, economic status, et cetera. But I do want to pivot a little bit, Alyssa, and ask, do you know, coming out of this now, of course, there's so much pressure. First of all, there was pressure on Mayor Adams to address the issue of crime in the city, and now to ensure that people feel safe on the subway. Do we know if there's any new initiatives that his administration has been putting forward or at least floating?
Well, what they immediately did, which I believe is still in place, is significantly increase the number of police patrolling on the subways. And I've experienced this, seeing pairs of officers in the subway cars, at stations, and at the ready. I do, I think it is so hard sometimes to, well, I think there's two issues we have to be careful not to conflate, right? It is incredibly hard to prevent an individual like this, who, as I said before, was really in part provoked by almost like on a dare by Adams saying we're going to escalate subway safety. He had already announced, along with Governor Hochul, had already announced a subway safety plan, more policing. And, this individual said, I'll show you, we'll see about that. But then more broadly, we have seen a general increase in crime across the city, and also an increase, especially relative to ridership, which is still depressed at about 60% of pre-pandemic levels. We've still seen an increase in crime in general. And I do think that the increased police presence, depending on where and when, what time of day, and so on, absolutely will be a deterrent, especially if, as promised, Adams has said, we're going to enforce, turnstile jumping and other infractions that are less serious than that. He's saying we're going to enforce the rules. Now, one thing he's up against, and he said that this is an issue, is that, you have district attorneys, including Alvin Bragg in Manhattan, who had already said, we're not going to prosecute turnstile jumping. So the question becomes, like, what is the sort of interaction with the criminal justice system as a whole? And sort of what does that add up to? You put police in the subway, there may be a deterrent, but at the same time, nothing is necessarily going to happen to people, even if the police do arrest someone. So I think some of these issues have to get worked out politically and practically as well.
Of course. I do want to pivot a little bit, though, because the story that probably would have been the A story that the shooting ended up overshadowing was the resignation and arrest of the lieutenant governor. And so, JC, the fact that there's now help wanted in Albany, we need another lieutenant governor. What do you think that another elected official getting out of Albany, getting embroiled in a scandal, getting arrested, what do you think that says to the public, especially going into this primaries season?
I think the public has to start taking politics seriously. We see New York City have dismal voter turnout, 15, 16% at times. We have council members and assembly members getting elected with 800 votes. It's a damn shame what's happening in New York, Jenna. We're not actively involved. The neighborhoods that need the most public assistance and most help aren't turning out to vote. And as a state, we have to take these elections more seriously. We have to start asking what's going on. The fact of the matter is, when you look at Brian Benjamin's resume, stellar, Brown, Harvard, involved in the community in every way possible. You think this guy is great. But the reality is that there was a rush to make this appointment. Somebody dropped the ball. Someone didn't study the background enough and put this individual to be a heartbeat away from the governorship of what I believe is the most important state in the country. I mean, that's a problem. And I think it was done politically. Here you have a conservative to moderate Democrat out of Western New York who says, I'm going to go to the most important Black power base in the world, the Harlem political power base, and pick a senator to be my lieutenant governor. And in doing so, made a rush to judgment and now is paying the price for things that she should have picked up if there was real background check. The truth of the matter is that New Yorkers are disheartened with the constant corruption coming out of Albany. We have one party rule. We have folks getting elected that should never be elected, but they are. And now there's an opportunity. There's a political opportunity for the governor to extend an olive branch to the Latino community in New York, to recognize that African-American and whites have every office statewide and every office citywide. And it's an opportunity for her to extend an olive branch and say, you Latinos, you matter, especially Hispanics in the Democratic Party who consistently in New York support the Democrats, and appoint a Democratic lieutenant governor to send a message to Latinos that Latinos matter. And I think this is an important moment for her.
So then, Nyla, this brings up two really important issues. One is that, do you see that the governor could possibly be looking at a Latino person to take over as lieutenant governor on the ticket? And then two, where does this leave Senator Benjamin's, or former Senator Benjamin turned to lieutenant governor, but where do you see this leaving his political base, at least? Do you see them supporting somebody else who is just a carbon copy, or perhaps turning to a different type of candidate?
So I would say that Governor Hochul, would be wise to elect someone of color. And to JC's point, there is a hunger for Latina representation. I would say a challenge that she would have though with that, and I think this goes back into the gubernatorial politics from last August, when she did have a potential challenger in, now, Attorney General Letitia James. She needed a lot of significant support from the Black community. And so she thought that by selecting Brian Benjamin, the senator, he would deliver the Harlem, which has historically been a stronghold of Black electoral power. I would argue that has shifted electorally, and that the Black electoral power in the city is now based in Brooklyn, but that is not to say that Harlem still has a significant amount of representative and symbolic power when it comes to Black politics here in the city. With that said, I think that to JC's point, I think that if Governor Kathy Hochul, wants to invigorate a bloc that has not necessarily been invigorated, I think that she would be smart to, bring on a Latino or Latina on her ticket. With that said, again, she'll be threading the needle and to not necessarily make the error that she made with Brian Benjamin in terms of you have the symbolic representation, but electorally, former Lieutenant Governor Brian Benjamin had never actually run a competitive campaign. He was always appointed his position, so he did not necessarily have his own voting bloc to deliver to her. And so she does go the way of identity politics and selecting someone who is Latino or Latina to make sure that they also have the ability to deliver the votes for her. And so it's not just a superficial representation of having someone from the who's Latino or Latina on the ticket. I think regarding where does Brian Benjamin's base go? Again, the base is, he didn't have one of his own, quite frankly, just to say it simply, in terms of, again, he never ran for his own Senate district. He was always appointed, never had a primary challenger. And then when he ran for city comptroller, he trailed in fourth. So his base, I think at its largest, if you're discussing his base as the Black electorate, are very faithful Democratic voters, right? And so I think that whoever's on the Democratic ticket, the base will most likely go with the Democratic ticket as well.
Alyssa, I just realized that as we're having this discussion that there might be some people who, while they know that the lieutenant governor was arrested and resigned from his position, they might not know exactly what for. So first, can you give us a recap of what exactly it was that led up to his corruption charges?
Sure. And this gets right back to what JC was saying before, that Hochul did not properly vet Benjamin, because this is a little self-promotion here, but my organization, the city, in late 2020, identified contributions to that losing controller campaign, which the Benjamin campaign had submitted for public matching dollars of 8-to-1. They were very, very suspicious donations. They were made in money orders. They were made by people whose names began with the letter A, who, when our reporter went and talked to them, said, "We've never heard of Brian Benjamin. What do you mean we gave money to him?" And so, that article came out in January 2021. And Hochul appointed Benjamin. She could have chosen anyone. She chose Brian Benjamin with all this information out there already, several months later after former Governor Andrew Cuomo resigned. So what did the question now is, what did Benjamin do, which we had seen signs of and that law enforcement was looking at. What he did was, according to prosecutors, he arranged for a grant to a supporter who he had asked to not just make a contribution to my campaign, which would have been limited to, not much more than $2,000 if this Harlem figure who gave him money had just given him a donation legitimately. He said, "I want you to come up with small donations so that we can get matching dollars," right? He wanted to game the matching dollar system. It's not clear whether or not Benjamin explicitly knew that this guy, Gerald Migdal, was in fact faking all these small donations and providing the money or paying people back to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. But Benjamin, according to prosecutors, knew that Migdal had done this previously for his Senate campaign. So he must have known something was up. And that's so what prosecutors have said. They said, look, this is a quid pro quo. Benjamin arranged for the grant, which did not go out the door. But he did say, hey, he even called the donor and said, hey, I got you this money. And then the donor said, okay, and here's some donations. And Benjamin would literally pick them up on a street corner or in the guy's apartment, big stacks of money orders. So it's a classic quid pro quo. And even though it's been harder in general to do federal prosecution cases because of a Supreme Court decision that says, you can't just have, a meeting or some other favor that's not monetary in exchange, for bribery with a public official. In this case, it was just classic textbook. They were able to charge him, and he of course has pleaded not guilty, Benjamin, but he's going to have a very difficult case to prove. There's ample evidence, and Migdal is clearly cooperating with the Fed. So we shall see what happens with Benjamin. The question is what happens with Hochul, and will she pay a political price for this just flabbergasting decision to appoint Benjamin with this information out there about him?
Well, those are definitely two stories that we will be following very closely. I want to thank my roundtable panel of guests, JC Polanco, Naila Amaru, and of course, Alyssa Katz. Thank you all so much for joining me on the MetroFocus Front Page Forecast.
Thank you.